The motion sensor chimed at 1:43 a.m., piercing through Michael Reeves's already fractured sleep. 42 years old, a high school chemistry teacher who'd just buried his wife 6 months prior, Michael grabbed his phone with trembling hands. The security camera feed showed them again. 4 teenagers laughing as they scaled his fence, their voices carrying across the still August night. 3 weeks. 21 days of this violation, of waking to find beer bottles floating in the pool Emma had loved, of scrubbing vomit off the deck where they'd scattered her ashes. The police had shrugged. His neighbors had offered sympathy, but no solutions. But tonight, Michael wasn't just watching through bleary, grief-stricken eyes. Tonight he was documenting. And what these kids didn't realize was that the exhausted teacher they'd been tormenting had finally stopped grieving. Long enough to get angry, and angry Michael. Reeves was a very different person then. Broken Michael Reeves. Before we dive into how a mild-mannered chemistry teacher became a force these teens would never forget. If you love stories where entitled people finally face real consequences and justice is served with precision, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see exactly how this unfolds. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that transformed grief into calculated rage. The confrontation where a teacher's knowledge became a weapon. And the resolution where 4 cocky teenagers learned that some people are dangerous precisely because they have everything to lose. In the first part, you'll witness how weeks of torment pushed a good man past his breaking point, how failed attempts at peace hardened into something colder, and how grief became the fuel for meticulous planning. The second part reveals the trap springing shut, the moment Michael stepped from the shadows with information that turned their blood to ice, the confrontation where every smirk died on their faces, and the ultimatum that left them with no escape. And in the final act, you'll see justice delivered with the precision of a chemical equation, complete with unexpected twists when parents arrived, reputations crumbled, and 4 entitled teenagers discovered that actions have consequences that compound with interest. Here's exactly how it happened. Michael Reeves had been a fixture at Riverside High for 18 years. The kind of teacher students remembered decades later, patient, brilliant, genuinely invested in their futures. At 42, he'd built a comfortable life in the quiet suburb of Meadowbrook, Massachusetts, with Emma, his wife of 16 years. The in-ground pool had been her dream, installed 3 years ago after her stage 4 breast cancer diagnosis. She'd spent her final summer floating under the stars, and Michael had promised to keep it pristine in her memory. He worked long hours, preparing engaging lessons, grading papers until midnight, pouring himself into teaching because it was the only thing that kept the crushing loneliness at bay. The house felt impossibly empty now, but the pool was sacred. It was the last place Emma had been truly happy, and Michael maintained it with religious devotion, testing pH levels daily, skimming leaves at dawn, keeping the water crystalline. He lived alone, had no children, and poured all his remaining love into preserving this one perfect thing. The first incident happened on a muggy Tuesday night in early August. Michael had fallen asleep on the couch around 11, exhausted from a professional development workshop. He woke at 3 to use the bathroom and noticed the back gate hanging open. His stomach dropped. In the pool, illuminated by the underwater lights he always left on, beer cans bobbed between inflatable toys he didn't own. A pizza box floated near the deep end. Muddy footprints covered the new deck furniture Emma had picked out. Michael's hands shook as he fished out the debris, telling himself it was random. Kids from the neighborhood taking advantage of an easy target. He didn't call the police. What would he even say? No permanent damage, just disrespect. He cleaned everything, relocked the gate, and tried to forget the violation. But 10 days later, it happened again. This time on a Friday night, and this time they'd been bolder. Michael discovered them because he hadn't been able to sleep. Grief was like that, ambushing him at random hours, and he'd heard splashing around midnight. By the time he reached the window, they were gone, but the evidence was worse. They'd used Emma's memorial wind chimes as bottle openers, bending the delicate copper tubes she'd loved. They'd ground cigarettes into the deck. Someone had vomited in the shallow end. Michael spent 4 hours that night draining and scrubbing, crying as he worked, and this time he did call the police. The responding officer, young and dismissive, shrugged and said without witnesses or video, there was nothing to do. Maybe get a better lock, he suggested, as if Michael hadn't thought of that. The humiliation burned worse than the violation. The third incident shattered something fundamental in Michael's soul. It was a Sunday night, and he'd spent the day at the cemetery talking to Emma's headstone about how lost he felt. He came home to find his pool trashed again, but this time they'd taken her ashes container, the beautiful hand-thrown pottery piece he'd kept on the deck shelf, and smashed it against the fence. Ceramic shards glittered in the grass. They'd drawn crude graffiti on his privacy fence in spray paint, and they'd stolen the solar lights Emma had arranged around the garden, the ones that made firefly patterns at night. Michael stood there in the darkness, shaking, and something inside him went cold and sharp. He'd tried being reasonable. He'd tried the authorities. He'd tried everything except what his darker instincts were now suggesting. The next morning, he confronted his neighbor, a chatty woman who seemed to know everyone. "Oh, probably the Bishop kids and their friends," she said casually. "They're always causing trouble. But you can't really do anything about it. Their dad's a lawyer." Michael smiled thinly and thanked her. That afternoon, he installed 4 hidden cameras with night vision. He began taking different routes home from school, watching for teenagers, memorizing faces and license plates. He stopped trying to sleep and started planning. Michael spent the next 2 weeks becoming someone he barely recognized. He used his faculty access to cross-reference license plates with student parking permits. He reached out to teacher friends at the middle school, gathering names and family information with casual questions. He studied property records online, finding addresses. By mid-August, he knew exactly who they were. Tyler Bishop, 16, son of attorney Richard Bishop. Marcus Chen, 17, whose mother was on the school board. Alyssa Rodriguez, 16, daughter of a local real estate developer. And Jake Morrison, 15, whose parents owned the biggest car dealership in town. Entitled kids with powerful parents who'd never faced real consequences. But Michael also knew their schedules, their vulnerabilities, and exactly how far he could push before crossing legal lines. If they wanted to play games with a chemistry teacher who'd lost everything that mattered, Michael would show them what games really looked like. He wasn't going to call the police again. He wasn't going to beg. He was going to teach them a lesson they'd never forget, delivered with the precision and cold calculation that only comes from having nothing left to lose. And on Friday, August 23rd, everything was finally ready. The motion sensor chimed at 1:43 a.m., and this time Michael was dressed, alert, and positioned in his darkened kitchen with a clear view of the backyard. He watched them come over the fence one by one. Tyler first, athletic and cocky, followed by Marcus with a backpack full of beer, then Alyssa filming on her phone, and finally Jake, the youngest, clearly nervous but trying to impress the others. They splashed into the pool fully clothed, whooping and hollering without a care in the world. Michael waited exactly 12 minutes, letting them get comfortable, letting them incriminate themselves on 4 different camera angles. Then he flipped on every outdoor light simultaneously. The pool lights, the deck floods, the motion sensors he'd repositioned for maximum illumination. The backyard exploded into daylight brightness, and the teenagers froze like deer in headlights. Michael stepped onto the deck, his face completely calm, holding a tablet that displayed all 4 camera feeds in real time. "Good evening, Tyler, Marcus, Alyssa, and Jake," he said quietly, his teacher voice carrying across the water with absolute authority. "I'm glad you could all make it. We have so much to discuss." The color drained from their faces. Tyler tried to recover his swagger. "We're leaving, old man. You can't prove—" "Tyler James Bishop," Michael interrupted, his voice never rising above conversational volume. 114 Oakwood Drive, son of Richard Bishop, partner at Bishop and Associates. Student at Riverside High, where I happen to have access to academic records showing your current 1.8 GPA and 3 cheating incidents. Tyler's mouth snapped shut. Michael descended the deck steps slowly, never breaking eye contact with any of them. Marcus Chen, 892 Birchwood Lane, 17 years old, planning to apply to MIT next year. Good luck with that when I send this footage to every college on your list. Your mother, Jennifer Chen, sits on the school board with me. I wonder how she'll feel knowing her son has been criminally trespassing and destroying property. Marcus, who'd been trying to climb out of the pool, stopped moving. Alyssa Rodriguez, 567 Maple Court. Your father, Ramon Rodriguez, sold me this house 4 years ago. Sweet guy. I still have his personal cell number. I'm sure he'd love to see the videos of his daughter vandalizing a widower's memorial to his dead wife. Alyssa's phone slipped from her hand into the pool. And Jake Morrison, 15 years old, 223 Cedar Street. Still a minor, which means your parents, David and Susan Morrison, would be personally liable for all damages you've caused. Michael pulled up a detailed spreadsheet on his tablet. Speaking of damages, let me show you what 3 weeks of your entertainment has cost me. Pool chemicals and extra filtrations, $400. Replacement solar lights, $270. Professional deck cleaning to remove cigarette burns and graffiti, $800. Replacement memorial pottery, custom-made, $600. New gate lock and security system, $1,200. Total, $3,270. Plus my time, which, as a credentialed educator with a master's degree, I value at $75 per hour. I've spent approximately 30 hours dealing with your vandalism. That's another $2,250. Michael let the numbers sink in while the 4 teenagers stood shivering in the pool, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. He knew everything about them because he'd made it his mission to know everything, their addresses from student records, their parents' information from public databases, and his extensive community network built over 18 years of teaching, their vulnerabilities from careful observation and strategic questions to colleagues. Tyler had been in his AP chemistry class 2 years ago and failed spectacularly. Marcus's mother had attended the same grief support group as Michael after Emma's diagnosis. Alyssa's Instagram was public, broadcasting every detail of her privileged life. Jake was the little brother of a former student who'd confided in Michael about family problems. He'd assembled this information with the same meticulous attention he brought to designing complex lab experiments, and now it was time for the practical application. Here's how this is going to work, Michael continued, his voice still eerily calm. You have 2 options. Option 1. I call all of your parents right now. Yes, I have all their numbers, and I call the police. I press charges for criminal trespassing, vandalism, and property destruction. I sue your families in civil court for damages. I personally deliver copies of this footage to the school administration, resulting in suspensions and permanent marks on your records. I post edited versions on social media showing your faces and behavior. Or option 2, you make this right. The silence stretched thin and terrible. Finally, Tyler tried to salvage some dignity. What do you want? Michael smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're going to pay restitution. $5,000, yes, more than the damages. Consider it pain and suffering. You're going to repair everything you've destroyed. You're going to clean this pool and deck until they're pristine. And you're going to do it tomorrow starting at 7 a.m. I'll be here supervising. You'll bring your own supplies. You'll work until the job is done to my satisfaction. And if you do this, if you complete everything without complaint, without your parents finding out, without any more problems, I'll delete the footage and we'll never speak of this again." He held up the tablet showing crystal-clear video of them climbing his fence, vandalizing his property, admitting their names on camera. "But if you refuse, if you try to retaliate, if you're even 1 minute late tomorrow, every parent, every administrator, and every police officer in this town gets a copy. I'm a widower and a respected teacher, with an impeccable reputation. You're entitled teenagers with a history of problems. Who do you think they'll believe?" Alyssa started crying. Jake looked like he might vomit. Marcus stared at the ground. Tyler's jaw clenched, but he nodded slowly. "Fine, 7 a.m. "Excellent choice," Michael said softly. "Now get out of my pool and go home. And boys, leave your wallets on the deck. I'm keeping your licenses as collateral." They scrambled out, dripping and defeated, fumbling their IDs onto the table. Michael watched them scale the fence and disappear into the darkness, then smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks. Emma would have told him he'd gone too far. But Emma wasn't here, and these kids had desecrated her memory. Tomorrow they'd begin to understand what that cost. At 6:47 a.m., all 4 teenagers appeared at Michael's front door, exhausted and surly but present. Tyler had dark circles under his eyes. Marcus carried cleaning supplies from his mother's housekeeping closet. Alyssa looked like she'd been crying all night. Jake could barely make eye contact. Michael led them to the backyard without a word and handed Tyler a list of tasks typed on school letterhead: professional, detailed, and non-negotiable. For the next 8 hours, he supervised as they scrubbed, cleaned, replanted, and repaired. When Tyler half-assed the deck scrubbing, Michael made him start over. When Alyssa complained about the heat, he reminded her that Emma had done chemotherapy in this same August heat while they'd been complaining about summer vacation. When Marcus tried to cut corners on the garden replanting, Michael made him redo every single solar light installation. Around 2 p.m., something unexpected happened. A silver Lexus pulled into the driveway, and Jennifer Chen, school board member and Marcus's mother, stepped out. Michael's heart rate spiked. This could ruin everything, but he kept his expression neutral. "Michael?" Jennifer approached, confused. "What's going on? Why is Marcus here?" Michael had prepared for this possibility. He gestured for her to follow him inside, then showed her selected clips from his security footage. Jennifer's face went from confusion to shock to barely contained fury. She watched her son laughing while defacing property, saw him drinking beer in a stranger's pool, heard him making crude jokes about the memorial items. "He told me he was at Tyler's house," she whispered. "How long has this been happening?" Michael explained everything calmly: the 3 weeks of violations, the police's indifference, his investigation, and the ultimatum he'd given the kids. He expected Jennifer to be angry at him for not involving parents immediately, but instead she looked devastated and grateful. "He's been so entitled lately," she said quietly. "His father and I have been too lenient. Thank you for not just calling the police." She marched outside and added her own consequences to Michael's punishment. Marcus would be grounded until Christmas. His college fund would pay Michael the full $5,000 immediately, and he'd be writing a formal apology letter to Michael and Emma's family. The other teenagers watched this unfold with growing horror, realizing their own parents might still find out. Tyler tried to quietly text someone, but Michael confiscated his phone. "No contact until the work is complete," he said firmly. By 6 p.m., the backyard was immaculate, better than it had been before the violation started. The pool sparkled, the deck gleamed, new solar lights glowed softly in the garden, and replacement plants filled the damaged beds. Michael inspected every detail with the same rigor he brought to grading lab reports, finding tiny imperfections and making them correct each one. Finally, as the sun set, He called them together on the deck. Tyler Bishop, Marcus Chen, Alyssa Rodriguez, Jake Morrison. Michael began, his voice carrying the weight of exhausted authority. You made my life hell for 3 weeks. You laughed when I asked you to stop. You destroyed the memorial to my wife who died 6 months ago after a 2-year battle with cancer. You thought there would be no consequences because your parents have money and influence. He paused, watching each face carefully. Marcus looked genuinely ashamed now. Alyssa was crying again. Jake stared at his shoes. Tyler's jaw remained stubbornly clenched, but even his defiance had wilted. But here's what you didn't understand. Some people are dangerous not because they're violent or cruel, but because they have nothing left to lose. You picked the wrong widower to torment. Michael pulled out their licenses and placed them on the table. I'm keeping the footage for 1 year. If I hear about any of you causing problems for anyone, not just me, but anyone in this community, it goes public immediately. If you've learned nothing else today, learn this. Actions have consequences. Sometimes those consequences come from a courtroom. Sometimes they come from a chemistry teacher who knows exactly how to make your lives miserable within completely legal boundaries. Now get out of my sight. They left silently, and Michael stood alone in his backyard as darkness fell, feeling something he hadn't felt since Emma's death. Not quite peace, but maybe the beginning of it. 2 months later, on a cool October evening, Michael floated in his pool under the stars. The water perfectly heated, the new solar lights creating gentle patterns across the surface. His neighbor had told him that Tyler's family had sent him to a military-style boarding school after other incidents came to light. Marcus was apparently excelling in his community service work and had written Michael a genuinely thoughtful apology letter. Alyssa had started volunteering at a grief counseling center. Jake had become noticeably more respectful at school. Whether they'd truly changed or just learned to hide their entitlement better, Michael didn't particularly care. His sanctuary was restored. His cameras remained active, but no one had tested his boundaries again. Word had spread through the teenage grapevine about the teacher who'd outsmarted the untouchable kids, and Michael's property had become conspicuously respected. He thought about Emma often, wondered what she'd think about his calculated revenge. She'd probably have wanted him to be more forgiving, more compassionate. But Emma had never had to protect her memory from people who'd tried to erase it. Michael had learned that sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom or a police report. Sometimes it comes from refusing to be a victim, from using knowledge as a weapon, from proving that even quiet, grief-stricken teachers have limits that shouldn't be tested. And as he floated there in the peace he'd reclaimed through precision and controlled fury, Michael smiled. A real smile this time, not the cold calculation of his revenge. Because justice, whether served hot or cold, immediate or delayed, was equally satisfying when it finally arrived. Across the country in Boulder, Colorado, retired Marine Colonel Patricia Vance was tending her rooftop garden when the new HOA president, a smug real estate developer named Brett Hoffman, demanded she remove her beehives within 24 hours or face daily fines. Patricia, 63 years old, with silver hair and deceptively gentle eyes, set down her pruning shears and smiled the same smile that had once preceded tactical operations in 3 different war zones. "Mr. Hoffman," she said quietly, pulling out the urban agricultural ordinance she'd personally helped draft with the city council 2 years prior, "I'd love to know who thinks they can bully a decorated veteran off her own property with threats that violate municipal code." She handed him a folder containing not just the ordinance, but documentation of every HOA violation his own rental properties had accumulated. Brett's face went from smug to pale in under 30 seconds. "Please," Patricia added, her voice dropping to a tone her former subordinates would have recognized immediately. "Keep making demands. I have 3 weeks of terminal leave saved and absolutely nothing better to do than dismantle your little power trip piece by legal piece. But that's a story for another time.